August 23, 1943, Fort Meade, Maryland. Kapitän Leutnant Wolfgang Luth stepped off the transport train and froze. His eyes swept across the vehicle depot stretching before him, row after row of brand-new Sherman tanks, their olive-drab paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, 50 visible from where he stood, perhaps 100 more beyond the first rows, all new, all identical, all waiting for shipment to Europe. "This cannot be accurate," he thought in German. "No nation produces armor at this scale. These must be gathered from across the country for propaganda purposes." But the American military police escorting him and 47 other U-boat survivors showed no particular interest in the tanks. They walked past them as one might walk past a row of parked automobiles, commonplace, unremarkable, beneath notice. One MP lit a cigarette without glancing at the armor. Another laughed at a joke Luth couldn't understand. Luth had commanded U-181, one of Germany's most successful submarines, sinking over 180,000 tons of Allied shipping during his career. He'd received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds directly from Adolf Hitler. He'd believed, had been certain, that Germany's U-boats were strangling America's capacity to wage war. The propaganda ministry's broadcasts claimed American production was collapsing, that civilian morale was cracking, that Roosevelt's war machine was a hollow facade. The Sherman tanks gleamed in silent rebuttal.
An American lieutenant colonel approached the prisoners, clipboard in hand. "Welcome to the United States," he said in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You'll be processed here before transport to your permanent camp assignment. The war, for you, is over." Perhaps, Luth thought, still staring at the tanks, but perhaps it was over before it even began. What Kapitän Leutnant Luth witnessed that August afternoon was the beginning of a revelation that would shatter the worldview of over 371,000 German prisoners of war who would arrive on American soil between 1943 and 1946. These men, Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe pilots, Kriegsmarine sailors, and Afrika Korps veterans, had been trained to believe in German industrial superiority and American weakness. They'd absorbed propaganda claiming the United States was a decadent nation of jazz musicians and gangsters incapable of matching German engineering and discipline. They were about to discover they'd been lied to on a scale so vast it defied comprehension. The story of German POWs in America is not primarily about captivity or prison camps. It is about the psychological destruction of an ideology through confrontation with undeniable material reality. It is about what happens when propaganda meets industrial capacity so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible. And it is about how Hitler's declaration of war against the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, represented not a bold strategic move, but a catastrophic miscalculation that doomed the Third Reich the moment American factories turned toward war production. The examination of what these prisoners witnessed would reveal a truth that German leadership either didn't understand or refused to accept. Modern warfare is determined not by battlefield tactics or individual soldier courage, but by industrial capacity. And America's industrial capacity operated at a scale Germany could never hope to match.
The journey to this revelation had begun more than 2 years earlier, on December 11, 1941, when Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. The decision followed Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor 4 days prior. Hitler was not obligated by treaty to join Japan's war against America. The tripartite pact required mutual defense only if a signatory was attacked, not if one launched an offensive strike.
But Hitler believed American entry into the European war was inevitable, and he calculated that striking first would give Germany the initiative. More critically, he fundamentally misunderstood what he was provoking. German intelligence estimates in late 1941 calculated American industrial capacity at approximately 60% of German levels. These estimates were catastrophically wrong. They failed to account for American production efficiency, the scale of American natural resources, the adaptability of American manufacturing, and most crucially, the American economy's vast excess capacity that could be redirected toward war production without sacrificing civilian needs. When America entered the war in December 1941, the nation possessed approximately 2,500 combat aircraft and fewer than 400 modern tanks. Germany, by contrast, had been rearming since 1933 and entered 1942 with battle-hardened divisions, thousands of tanks, and aircraft designs proven in combat across Europe. What German planners failed to anticipate was the speed and scale of American mobilization.
By December 1942, exactly 1 year after entering the war, American factories had produced 47,836 military aircraft. In that same year, Germany produced 15,556. The disparity shocked German intelligence analysts who intercepted these figures through neutral sources. Surely, they reasoned, these numbers included trainers, transports, and obsolete types. The Americans must be inflating their statistics for propaganda purposes. They weren't. The numbers were conservative, if anything. American production accelerated through 1943 and 1944, reaching peaks that made the 1942 figures seem modest. The Boeing plant in Seattle produced B-17 Flying Fortresses at a rate of 16 per day at peak production. The Willow Run factory outside Detroit, built specifically to manufacture B-24 Liberators, covered 3.5 million square feet under one roof and produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes at maximum capacity. Chrysler Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant began construction in September 1940 and produced its first M3 tank in April 1941, 7 months from groundbreaking to production. By August 1943, when Luth arrived at Fort Meade, this single facility had produced over 18,000 tanks. It operated continuously, 3 shifts daily, 7 days weekly, with workers earning wages that exceeded what most German families saw in a year. But German prisoners of war knew none of this when they arrived. They knew only what propaganda had told them. America was weak, divided, unprepared. American soldiers were soft. American industry was inefficient. American resolve would crumble. The first German POWs arrived in the United States in July 1943, transported from North African camps after the Wehrmacht's surrender in Tunisia. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, responsible for POW administration, established a network of camps designed to hold anticipated prisoner numbers based on Allied offensive planning. Initial projections estimated 50,000 maximum.
By war's end, 371,683 German POWs would pass through American camps. The Provost Marshal General's office established 511 separate POW facilities across 44 states. These included 155 major base camps and 356 branch camps located strategically near agricultural regions, forests, and industrial areas where prisoner labor could supplement America's workforce without threatening security.
Camp Alva in Oklahoma could house 3,000 prisoners. Camp Hearne in Texas held 4,800. Camp Stark in New Hampshire accommodated 250. Branch camps in remote agricultural areas sometimes held as few as 50 men. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which Germany had signed, established specific requirements for POW treatment. Prisoners were entitled to the same rations as the captor nation's troops, protection from combat zones, payment for labor, medical care, recreational opportunities, and mail privileges. The United States, determined to demonstrate moral superiority and encourage German compliance with convention obligations toward American POWs, adhered strictly to these requirements. German prisoners received the same 4,000-calorie daily ration as American soldiers: meat, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and dessert at most meals. They earned 80 cents per day for labor, paid in camp scrip redeemable for cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other canteen items. They played sports, attended concerts, took educational classes, and received uncensored letters from home through the International Red Cross. For men who'd fought in North Africa, Russia, or Italy, who'd experienced hunger, cold, constant danger, and watched their units decimated, arrival in American POW camps represented a jarring cognitive dissonance. The food alone exceeded what most had eaten as free soldiers in the Wehrmacht. The living conditions surpassed what German workers experienced in the Reich. The casual abundance of basic goods, soap, toilet paper, cigarettes, chocolate, seemed impossible for a nation supposedly struggling under wartime privation. But the real psychological shock came when prisoners saw American war production firsthand.
The revelation emerged gradually through accumulated observations impossible to dismiss or explain away. At Camp Alva, Oklahoma, established in July 1943, German prisoners worked in local agriculture, picking cotton and harvesting wheat alongside American farmers. The prisoners expected subsistence farming operations similar to rural Germany. Instead, they found mechanized agriculture on a scale that defied their understanding of farming. American farmers operated John Deere tractors, pulling multi-row implements. They owned pickup trucks, personal vehicles for farm use. Their barns contained equipment worth more than German farming villages possessed collectively. One prisoner, Feldwebel Heinz Janssen of the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote, "The American farmer lived better than German factory owners I had known. He had electricity, a telephone, a radio, an automobile, and machinery for every task. His children were healthy and well-fed. His wife wore store-bought clothes. And this was considered normal, not wealth, but ordinary American rural life." The cognitive dissonance intensified when prisoners received Red Cross packages. The Geneva Convention required belligerent nations to permit neutral parties to supply POWs with supplementary food and comfort items. In practice, Germany frequently blocked or delayed Red Cross shipments to Allied prisoners, citing transportation difficulties or claiming supplies aided the enemy war effort. America placed no such restrictions. Red Cross packages arrived regularly at every POW camp, distributed weekly. Each package contained cigarettes, coffee, chocolate bars, canned meat, condensed milk, and other luxury items. Prisoners who'd smoked wood chips or acorn coffee in Russia now had genuine cigarettes and real coffee in unlimited supply. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, Oberleutnant Franz Steger, a Luftwaffe ace credited with 28 kills, wrote to his family through Red Cross mail channels, "They give us more than German civilians receive on ration cards. The cigarettes alone would cost a month's wages in Berlin. Either the Red Cross has infinite resources, or America has so much surplus it can afford to supply enemy prisoners as if they were guests." The truth, Incomprehensible to men raised under Nazi autarky was both. America's productive capacity created surplus on a scale that made supplying 371,000 enemy prisoners a trivial administrative detail, rather than a significant economic burden. But packages and farm equipment, however impressive, might be explained as isolated examples, or special treatment designed to impress prisoners for propaganda purposes. The industrial revelations proved harder to rationalize. Prisoners transported between camps witnessed American manufacturing capacity through train windows and truck convoys. They saw freight yards stretching for kilometers, packed with rail cars. They passed factory complexes covering dozens of hectares, chimneys trailing smoke 24 hours daily. They watched highways filled with civilian automobiles, personal vehicles owned by ordinary workers, not government officials or military officers. At Camp Hearne, Texas, prisoners worked in nearby timber operations, cutting lumber for military construction. The logging equipment included gasoline-powered chainsaws, mechanical loaders, and purpose-built logging trucks. The operation produced more lumber in a week than German camps had produced in months using manual saws and horse-drawn wagons.
The prisoners began comparing notes, sharing observations, trying to construct a coherent understanding. The pattern emerged. American abundance wasn't limited to specific facilities or showcase examples. It was universal, encompassing every aspect of American industrial and agricultural life. At Camp Stark, New Hampshire, prisoners processed timber for paper production. The facility received logs by truck from multiple states, processed them through automated mills, and produced paper products shipped nationwide. The prisoners calculated the facility's output, more paper in a month than comparable German operations produced in a year. At Camp Ellis, Illinois, prisoners worked food processing operations, canning vegetables and meat for military rations. The industrial canning lines operated continuously, processing thousands of tons of food weekly. Sergeant Matthias Heck, a prisoner assigned to the facility, later recalled, "We filled more cans in an hour than a German factory filled in a day. The machinery never stopped. When one shift ended, another began immediately. The food kept coming. Potatoes from Idaho, beef from Texas, vegetables from California, as if the entire continent existed to feed the canning line." The prisoners witnessed military convoys passing through nearby highways, truck after truck, stretching beyond sight, carrying equipment, supplies, and troops. All the vehicles were new, identical, mass-produced. A single convoy contained more trucks than entire German divisions possessed. The psychological impact accumulated like water behind a dam. Each observation added weight. Each comparison with German equivalents revealed the gap. Each casual display of abundance, a discarded chocolate bar, a warehouse full of spare parts, a parking lot full of vehicles, reinforced the same impossible conclusion. America wasn't struggling to match German production. America was operating at a level beyond German comprehension, producing war material as if resources were infinite, treating military equipment with the casual disregard of overwhelming surplus. And the German prisoners, who'd believed Nazi propaganda about American weakness and Jewish plutocratic decadence, couldn't reconcile these observations with anything they'd been told. The cognitive dissonance would only intensify.
October 17, 1944, Camp Hearne, Texas. Hauptmann Friedrich Guggenberger stood at the perimeter fence watching the highway. He'd been counting for 47 minutes. The convoy passing on Route 6 consisted entirely of GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the standard American military transport vehicle. Olive drab, 6 wheels, open cargo bed, canvas top, identical in every detail. Brand new, their paint unmarked by weather or use. 532 trucks passed before the convoy's end. Guggenberger knew because he'd counted every one, scratching tallies in the dirt with a stick. The mathematics churned through his mind automatically, the calculations of a professional soldier assessing logistics. 532 trucks, each capable of carrying 2.5 tons of supplies or 24 troops. Total capacity, 1,330 tons, or 12,768 men. This single convoy could transport an entire division's support elements. His own unit, the 116th Panzer Division, had entered Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 with 187 trucks of mixed types and conditions. Many had been captured Czech or French vehicles. Few remained operational by the Russian winter. The division had begged, borrowed, and scavenged transport throughout the Eastern Front campaign, never possessing sufficient vehicles for its nominal strength. And here, passing a POW camp in rural Texas, rolled 532 brand-new trucks in a single convoy, heading to port for shipment to Europe. One convoy, one day, from facilities Guggenberger couldn't even see. We never had a chance, he thought. We were fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemy.
He turned to find several fellow officers standing behind him, watching the same convoy. Nobody spoke. What could be said? The evidence rolled past at 35 kilometers per hour, each truck another nail in the coffin of German victory hopes. Oberst Hans Werner of the Afrika Korps finally broke the silence. I fought in North Africa. We received perhaps 20 trucks monthly as replacements. They were prioritized above ammunition sometimes. A functioning truck was worth more than gold. We treated each vehicle like a panzer, because losing one meant mission failure. He gestured at the highway. They produce more in an afternoon than we received in a year. The revelation at Camp Hearne crystallized what German prisoners across 511 camps were independently discovering. American industrial capacity didn't just exceed German production. It operated in a different category entirely, rendering comparison meaningless. The highest-ranking German officer held in American captivity experienced this revelation most intensely. General der Panzertruppe Hans Kramer, captured in North Africa in May 1943, arrived in the United States in August of that year. As a general officer, Kramer received special treatment under Geneva Convention protocols, including tours of non-sensitive facilities designed to demonstrate American compliance with international law. In October 1943, American authorities arranged for Kramer to visit steel production facilities in Pennsylvania. The purpose, from the American perspective, was proving they weren't abusing prisoners or violating treaty obligations. They wanted a senior German officer to return home after the war and testify that America had honored its commitments.
They achieved that goal. But they also accomplished something unintended. They broke General Kramer's certainty that Germany could win the war. The Bethlehem Steel Plant in Lackawanna, New York, covered over 1,200 acres. It employed 20,000 workers operating in 3 continuous shifts. The facility produced 1,497,000 tons of rolled steel products monthly. Structural shapes, plate steel, and specialized alloys for armor, ships, and aircraft. The plant operated 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Its furnace is never cooling, its production never pausing. Kramer toured the facility with American officers and plant managers. They showed him blast furnaces producing liquid iron, rolling mills shaping steel plate, and quality control operations testing material properties. They explained,
Proudly, with the enthusiasm of engineers discussing their craft, the production optimizations they'd implemented to increase output. They mentioned, casually, that this was one of 15 major steel plants operating at similar capacity. Kramer performed the calculations. Germany's total annual steel production in 1943 reached approximately 20.5 million tons. This single American plant produced nearly 18 million tons annually. 15 such plants, and Kramer knew the Americans weren't exaggerating because the evidence stood before him, roaring and smoking and producing, meant America's steel production exceeded 270 million tons annually. The numbers weren't just larger, they were categorically different, representing productive capacity beyond Germany's ability to match, even if every German factory operated at maximum efficiency with unlimited resources. But the tours revealed something more devastating than numbers. They revealed philosophy.
American factory workers earned wages that exceeded Wehrmacht officer pay. They worked 8-hour shifts with lunch breaks and safety equipment. They belonged to unions that could negotiate with management. They owned automobiles, lived in houses with electricity and indoor plumbing, and sent their children to schools that taught critical thinking rather than ideology. And these well-paid, comfortable, educated workers produced more per capita than German workers laboring 12-hour days under threat of punishment for insufficient output. Kramer watched American workers change shifts, saw the cafeterias serving hot meals, noticed the safety posters and production incentive programs. He compared this to German factories where workers survived on ersatz coffee and watery soup, where strategic bombing had destroyed housing and infrastructure, where production decreased monthly despite desperate exhortations to greater effort. The revelation was philosophical as much as material. Treating workers well produced better results than coercion. Paying adequate wages created loyal, productive employees. Maintaining civilian quality of life sustained morale and motivated voluntary extra effort. America's system, democracy, capitalism, individual liberty wasn't decadent weakness. It was competitive advantage. When Kramer returned to his camp, he requested permission to write a report on American industrial capacity. The request reached Swiss diplomatic channels. Permission was denied. His observations were deemed defeatist, his conclusions propaganda-influenced. He was instructed to maintain faith in German victory and await repatriation. But Kramer couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. The numbers, the scale, the systematic organization. It rendered German victory impossible regardless of battlefield tactics or soldier courage. Germany was fighting an opponent that could lose 10 tanks and produce 15 replacements within days. An opponent that could sustain million-man armies across 3 continents simultaneously while civilian abundance increased. An opponent whose industrial capacity treated the entire European theater as one supply zone among several. Other prisoners reached similar conclusions through different paths.
At Camp Como, Mississippi, Luftwaffe prisoners worked at a nearby airfield performing maintenance on training aircraft. They watched American pilot cadets, boys barely 18 years old, train in masses of aircraft the Luftwaffe could never hope to produce. The Americans trained pilots beyond any conceivable immediate need, creating surplus capacity against future losses. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, Wehrmacht prisoners worked agricultural operations along.
At Camp Como, Mississippi, Luftwaffe prisoners worked at a nearby airfield performing maintenance on training aircraft. They watched American pilot cadets, boys barely 18 years old, train in masses of aircraft the Luftwaffe could never hope to produce.
The Americans trained pilots beyond any conceivable immediate need, creating surplus capacity against future losses. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, Wehrmacht prisoners worked agricultural operations alongside American farmers who complained about labor shortages while operating equipment that eliminated the need for the very labor they claimed to lack. The contradiction revealed the scale of surplus. Americans viewed productivity as insufficient when it merely doubled German equivalents. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, prisoners watched American divisions train with live ammunition in quantities that exceeded German frontline units' monthly allocations. The Americans practiced with such profligate ammunition expenditure that prisoners assumed it was a one-time demonstration. It wasn't. Every unit trained this way every day. The pattern repeated at every camp, in every state, in every work detail and observation. The conclusion became inescapable. Germany had started a war against an opponent whose industrial capacity rendered battlefield outcomes nearly irrelevant. America could lose every battle and still win through sheer material accumulation. Germany could win every battle and still lose because American factories could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. By late 1944, as the Allied armies advanced into Germany itself, POWs in American camps received letters from families describing conditions in the Reich. Cities in ruins from strategic bombing, food shortages, fuel rationing, electrical blackouts, and always the exhortations to maintain faith, to believe in final victory, to trust that new weapons would turn the tide. The prisoners read these letters in camps where they ate 3 meals daily, played football on manicured fields, attended concerts and movies, and worked jobs earning wages they sent home to starving families. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some. Others simply accepted the obvious conclusion and waited for the war's inevitable end. The POW experience had become an unintended psychological warfare campaign more effective than any propaganda program, because it wasn't propaganda. It was reality, undeniable and overwhelming, crushing Nazi ideology through simple material facts.
The journey to this revelation began years before the first German POW set foot in America, in the fundamental economic and philosophical differences that shaped each nation's approach to industrial production. Germany entered rearmament in 1933 under constraints that shaped every subsequent decision. The Treaty of Versailles had limited German military capacity, dismantled industrial production, and imposed reparations that crippled economic growth. When Hitler repudiated these restrictions and began rebuilding Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, Germany faced severe resource limitations. Its nation lacked domestic oil production, depending on synthetic fuel facilities and limited imports. It possessed insufficient rubber production, requiring ersatz substitutes inferior to natural rubber. Its steel production, while sophisticated, operated at capacity limits that couldn't expand beyond available raw materials. Its industrial capacity remained concentrated in the Ruhr Valley and other regions vulnerable to strategic bombing. These constraints forced German military planners to prioritize quality over quantity. They couldn't match potential opponents in production numbers, so they focused on technological superiority, better tanks, better aircraft, better weapons that might offset numerical disadvantages. The strategy succeeded in early campaigns where German panzers outclassed French armor and Luftwaffe aircraft dominated Polish and French opponents.
but the strategy contained fatal assumptions. It assumed wars would be short, decided by quick victories before attrition became relevant. It assumed opponents couldn't match German technological sophistication. It assumed economic constraints affecting Germany also limited enemy production capacity. Every assumption proved wrong.
America entered war production from opposite circumstances. The nation possessed vast natural resources, oil fields in Texas and California, iron ore in Minnesota, coal in Appalachia, copper in Montana, rubber plantations in territories across the Pacific. It maintained industrial overcapacity from the Depression era, idle factories, unemployed workers, unused productive potential waiting for demand. When war came, America converted civilian production to military output at scales European nations couldn't imagine. Automobile factories began producing tanks and aircraft. Shipyards multiplied their capacity. Steel mills expanded output. The nation possessed resources to build new facilities without sacrificing existing production, a luxury Germany never enjoyed. But resources alone didn't explain American productive supremacy. Philosophy mattered. American industrial production emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, and mass production. Henry Ford's assembly line principles had revolutionized manufacturing decades before the war, creating systems where semi-skilled workers using purpose-built tools could produce complex equipment efficiently. The nation's entire industrial base operated on these principles. German production, by contrast, emphasized craftsmanship and precision. German tanks were engineering marvels, superbly designed, carefully manufactured, incorporating innovations like sloped armor and high-velocity guns years before opponents. But each tank required skilled machinists, hand-fitted components, and specialized tools. Production rates suffered accordingly. The Tiger I tank, arguably the best tank of the war on a unit basis, required 300,000 man-hours to produce. Germany manufactured 1,347 Tigers total from August 1942 through August 1944. The American M4 Sherman tank, inferior in armor and firepower on paper, required 10,000 man-hours to produce. America manufactured 49,238 Shermans during the war.
The mathematics were brutally simple. German forces could destroy 3, 4, even 5 Shermans for every Tiger lost. America would still win because they'd produce 15 Shermans for every Tiger Germany built. Tactical superiority meant nothing against strategic production supremacy. This philosophical difference extended beyond specific weapons to entire systems. German aircraft featured sophisticated engineering, fuel injection engines, cannon armament, advanced aerodynamics. American aircraft used simpler systems, carbureted engines, machine gun armament, straightforward designs that untrained mechanics could maintain under field conditions. German forces discovered that their technologically superior equipment required supply chains they couldn't sustain. A Panther tank's sophisticated transmission required specialized replacement parts manufactured at specific facilities. When those facilities were bombed, the entire fleet became unmaintainable. Sherman tanks used commercial truck components. Replacement parts came from civilian automotive suppliers across an entire continent. The American system assumed equipment would break, soldiers would make mistakes, and supply lines would fail. It designed for these inevitabilities, creating robust systems that functioned despite imperfection. The German system assumed competent operators, functioning supply chains, and available replacement parts. It optimized for ideal conditions that never existed in sustained warfare. POWs witnessed this philosophical difference in every aspect of American military operations. They saw American soldiers discard equipment that German forces would have carefully repaired and reused. They watched supply depots stack materials casually without the desperate conservation German forces practiced. They observed American maintenance operations replace entire engines rather than repair specific components because new engines cost less than the labor required for repairs. The revelation was economic. America fought a rich man's war, treating material as expendable and prioritizing soldier welfare. Germany fought a poor man's war, conserving every resource while expending soldiers freely. One prisoner, Lieutenant Helmut König of the 352nd Infantry Division, later wrote, "American soldiers complained about their equipment constantly. Their rifles jammed, their radios failed, their vehicles broke down. But within hours, sometimes minutes, replacements arrived. They never learned to maintain equipment properly because they never needed to. If something broke, they got a new one. We Germans maintained our equipment obsessively because replacement meant waiting months if it came at all. We thought this made us superior soldiers. We didn't understand it made us losers in an industrial war."
The design philosophy extended to human resources. America could afford massive training programs because it possessed enough equipment to dedicate aircraft and tanks solely to instruction. German pilots often reached combat units with fewer than 150 flight hours because training aircraft were needed for operations. American pilots routinely trained for 300-plus hours before frontline assignment. The results showed in loss ratios. German pilots initially achieved better kill ratios than American counterparts. They were better trained, more experienced, flying superior aircraft. But America produced 5 pilots for every 1 Germany trained, and 10 aircraft for every 1 Germany manufactured. The superior German pilots died or were captured, while American replacements kept coming. By 1944, Luftwaffe squadrons operated at quarter strength, with pilots flying their first combat missions against American veterans with hundreds of hours' experience. The technological edge had reversed, the training gap had inverted, and production capacity had determined the outcome regardless of individual courage or skill. German POWs understood this intellectually as they witnessed American abundance. But emotional acceptance required confronting an uncomfortable truth. They'd fought brilliantly and courageously for a nation whose leadership had committed them to an unwinnable war through strategic incompetence. Hitler's declaration of war against America on December 11, 1941, had guaranteed German defeat. Every battle afterward, every sacrifice, every death, all had been meaningless gestures, delaying inevitable surrender. The industrial capacity imbalance was so vast that German victory required not tactical or operational excellence, but American collapse from internal causes. That collapse never came. The POWs saw why. American civilians supported the war because the war didn't significantly diminish their quality of life. Yes, certain goods were rationed, sugar, gasoline, and rubber, but Americans ate better in 1938 than in 1938. Employment reached full capacity, wages increased, housing improved. The nation fought a global war while civilian prosperity increased. Germany, by contrast, descended into hell. Cities burned, food disappeared, infrastructure crumbled.
The population endured because German propaganda convinced them they were fighting for survival against enemies seeking their extermination. The POWs in America discovered this was projection. Germany had fought wars of extermination and now faced justified retribution. But understanding the strategic situation didn't ease the psychological burden. These men had believed Nazi ideology, trusted their leadership, and fought courageously for a cause they'd thought just. The revelation that they'd been lied to, that German victory had never been possible, that their sacrifices had served a criminal regime, this destroyed them more effectively than any battlefield defeat.
The consequences of the POW experience on American soil unfolded across multiple dimensions: psychological, political, and cultural. For the prisoners themselves, the experience created permanent cognitive shifts. Post-war surveys of German POW returnees revealed that 74% expressed positive views of American society. 68% rejected Nazi ideology after their American experience, and 43% attempted to emigrate to the United States after repatriation. These numbers terrified both American and German authorities for different reasons. American officials worried that treating enemy prisoners well might encourage German resistance by demonstrating that capture meant safety and comfort rather than death or suffering. In practice, the opposite occurred. German soldiers who knew they'd be treated humanely surrendered more readily, reducing American casualties. German authorities worried that returning POWs would poison public opinion with accurate accounts of American industrial capacity and social conditions. They were correct. Returning prisoners told families, neighbors, and friends what they'd witnessed. The stories spread, corroding what remained of faith in German victory. The labor program produced its own ironies. German POWs earned 80 cents per day for agricultural work, forestry, food processing, and other non-military labor. This wage, paid in camp scrip, could be sent home to families through Red Cross channels. Many prisoners sent their entire earnings to wives, parents, and children in Germany, where the money could purchase goods on black markets or through authorized channels. The result: German families received more reliable financial support from imprisoned relatives working for America than they'd received when those relatives fought for Germany. Wehrmacht pay often didn't reach families due to postal disruptions, currency inflation, or administrative failures. POW wages arrived regularly, predictably, with the efficiency Americans brought to every systematic endeavor. Prisoner Reinhold Poebel provided the most dramatic example of POW experience impact. Poebel, captured in North Africa, was assigned to Camp Grant, Illinois, then transferred to a branch camp in Iowa. In September 1945, with the war's end, Poebel escaped during a work detail, not to return to Germany, but to remain in America.
He traveled to Chicago, obtained forged documents, and lived as Philip Brick for 8 years, working various jobs and fully integrating into American society. He married an American woman, owned a home, and lived as a middle-class American without arousing suspicion. In 1953, he voluntarily surrendered to authorities after reading about another escaped POW's capture. Rather than face prosecution, Poebel was allowed to return to Germany, but he immediately began legal immigration proceedings, eventually returning to America permanently as a naturalized citizen. Poebel's case wasn't unique. Dozens of German POWs escaped American camps, not from abuse or mistreatment, but because they preferred American life to returning home. Most were recaptured or surrendered voluntarily. None faced serious punishment. Several eventually immigrated legally. The Geneva Convention Compliance Program achieved its intended purpose,
demonstrating American moral superiority and encouraging reciprocal treatment of American POWs held by Germany. But it accomplished something more profound. It won the peace before the war ended. German prisoners returned home as ambassadors for American values, whether intentionally or not. They'd witnessed democracy functioning effectively, capitalism creating prosperity, and individual liberty coexisting with social order. These observations contradicted everything Nazi ideology taught about decadent plutocratic democracies inevitably collapsing into chaos and weakness. Post-war Germany's rapid adoption of democratic governance and market economics owed something to returning POWs who'd seen these systems work in America. The Marshall Plan succeeded partly because Germans who'd experienced American abundance knew reconstruction was possible if they embraced American methods.
The cultural impact extended beyond politics and economics. German POWs introduced American music, sports, and customs to German communities after repatriation. They taught English to children, organized baseball games, and shared American recipes. These small cultural exchanges, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of families, helped transform German society from militaristic authoritarianism toward democratic pluralism.
But the experience also created lasting trauma. Many prisoners struggled with guilt over their service to the Nazi regime, over surviving while comrades died, over enjoying comfort while families suffered. Some developed lasting friendships with American guards and civilians, creating emotional conflicts between national loyalty and personal bonds. Others rejected their American experience entirely, insisting conditions had been harsh and treatment cruel, because accepting the truth meant confronting their complicity in an evil cause. The youngest prisoners, teenagers drafted in the war's final months, faced unique challenges. They'd known only Nazi Germany, absorbed its ideology as education, and fought because they knew nothing else. Their American experience often represented their first exposure to alternative worldviews. Many later credited POW camp educational programs, recreational activities, and interactions with Americans as critical in deprogramming their Nazi indoctrination. POW camp newspapers provide insight into prisoners' psychological evolution. Initially, many camps published newspapers filled with nationalist rhetoric, refusals to accept defeat, and insistence on eventual German victory. As the war progressed and Germany's collapse became undeniable, these publications shifted toward practical content, English lessons, job skills, and information about democratic governance.
By early 1945, some camp newspapers openly discussed Nazi crimes, printed information about concentration camps, and debated Germany's moral responsibility. American authorities carefully monitored these publications, allowing prisoners to work through psychological transformations without interference. The result was more effective than any re-education program could have achieved. Prisoners convinced each other through confronting undeniable evidence. The most poignant transformation occurred among prisoners who'd lost faith in German victory but maintained personal honor through continued military bearing. These men, often career soldiers or officers, performed their duties, maintained discipline, and treated American guards with respect, while privately acknowledging Germany's inevitable defeat. They represented professionalism divorced from ideology, soldierly conduct separated from political belief. General Hans Kramer embodied this category.
Despite his recognition of German defeat's inevitability after witnessing American steel production, he maintained military discipline and dignity throughout his captivity. When repatriated in May 1944 as part of a prisoner exchange due to health issues, he reported honestly to German authorities about American productive capacity and was promptly ignored, his observations dismissed as defeatist propaganda. Kramer's experience illustrated the final tragedy. Even when German leadership received accurate intelligence about American industrial supremacy, they refused to accept reality. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry continued broadcasting claims of American weakness, industrial collapse, and imminent Allied defeat long after these assertions had become laughable fantasies.
The prisoners knew better. They'd seen the factories, counted the trucks, eaten the food, and witnessed abundance that made propaganda claims transparently false. But they remained imprisoned, unable to communicate their knowledge to families still believing in final victory through secret weapons or miraculous intervention.
The psychological burden intensified as news from Europe worsened. Letters from home described increasing devastation, cities bombed into rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies exhausted. Prisoners read these accounts while eating 3 meals daily in comfortable barracks, working jobs that paid wages they sent home to help families survive. The contrast created impossible emotional dynamics. They wanted Germany to win for their family's sake, for national pride, for ideological commitment. But they knew Germany couldn't win, and part of them recognized that German defeat might be morally necessary given the regime's crimes. They hoped their families would survive, but survival increasingly meant German surrender. They maintained military identity, but fighting had become pointless. They respected American guards, but these guards represented the enemy destroying their homeland. These contradictions produced various responses. Some prisoners retreated into rigid military formalism, performing duties with mechanical precision while refusing emotional engagement. Others embraced American culture enthusiastically, learning English, adopting American mannerisms, and planning post-war emigration. A minority remained fanatically Nazi, organizing underground cells, attacking prisoners who collaborated with Americans, and maintaining hope in final victory despite overwhelming evidence. Camp authorities managed these tensions carefully. They separated hardcore Nazis from general population prisoners to prevent violence. They provided news through screened German-language newspapers and radio broadcasts. They allowed prisoners to form recreational clubs, sports teams, and cultural groups that provided purpose and structure. They enforced discipline when necessary, but treated prisoners with humanity that often surprised men expecting brutality. The strategy succeeded. Prisoner uprisings occurred rarely, and when they did, involved small groups of fanatics rather than mass rebellions. Most prisoners cooperated with camp administration, performed assigned labor, and waited for the war's end with resignation rather than resistance. By spring 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany, American POW camps housed over 371,000 German prisoners living in circumstances materially superior to conditions their families endured in occupied Germany. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, prisoners received the news through official camp announcements. Reactions varied by individual temperament and political commitment. Some wept openly, mourning Germany's defeat and recognizing their family's peril. Others expressed relief that the killing had ended. A few celebrated, having abandoned Nazi ideology and embraced democratic values during captivity. But the dominant emotion was uncertainty. What happened now? Would they face war crimes trials? Would they be repatriated immediately or remain imprisoned for years? Would their families survive the occupation? Would Germany even exist as a nation, or would it be partitioned and absorbed by the victors? American authorities provided answers gradually. The vast majority of prisoners would face no criminal charges. They'd been soldiers fighting for their nation, not criminals committing atrocities. Repatriation would occur systematically, beginning in 1946 after European conditions stabilized enough to receive hundreds of thousands of returnees. Prisoners could continue working for wages, and those wages would still be sent home to help families survive occupation. The period between May 1945 and final repatriation in July 1946 represented a strange interregnum. The war had ended, but imprisonment continued. Prisoners remained subject to military discipline, but no longer considered enemies. Many worked alongside American civilians in agriculture and forestry, developing personal relationships that complicated national identities. Some prisoners married American women, either locals they'd met during work details or European refugees they encountered through Red Cross channels. American authorities initially prohibited such marriages, but eventually relented, recognizing that preventing personal relationships served no legitimate purpose. Approximately 3,000 German POWs married American citizens during or immediately after their captivity. The repatriation process began in January 1946. Prisoners boarded transport ships in reverse order of their arrival. Those captured latest left first, those captured earliest left last. The voyages typically lasted 10 to 14 days, depositing men at German ports where they faced immediate challenges. Germany lay in ruins. The systematic strategic bombing campaign had destroyed major cities, industrial facilities, and transportation infrastructure. Food production had collapsed. Currency had become worthless. Black markets dominated economic exchange. Displaced persons wandered across the landscape seeking lost families. The occupation authorities struggled to maintain order while processing millions of returning soldiers, millions of displaced civilians, and millions of refugees fleeing Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe. Returning POWs entered this chaos carrying American experiences incompatible with German reality. They'd spent years in comfortable captivity, eating well, working for wages, and witnessing industrial abundance. Now they confronted starvation, homelessness, and destruction. The contrast reinforced everything they'd concluded during captivity. Germany had provoked a war it could never win against an opponent operating at incomprehensible industrial scales. Post-war surveys tracked returning POWs' attitudes and adjustment. The data revealed striking patterns. Former prisoners adapted more successfully to occupation than soldiers who'd surrendered in Germany, because POWs had already psychologically processed defeat during captivity. They expressed more favorable views toward democratic governance, having witnessed democracy functioning effectively in America. They showed less susceptibility to revanchist or neo-Nazi movements, having understood Germany's strategic impossibility of victory. These findings influenced Allied occupation policy. American authorities recruited former POWs for administrative positions, reconstruction projects, and political organizations, recognizing that their American experience had created psychological preparation for democratic transition. The strategy succeeded. Many prominent West German politicians, businessmen, and cultural figures of the 1950s and 1960s
had spent time as American POWs during the war.
But success came with moral complexity. These men had fought for Nazi Germany, participated in wars of aggression, and in some cases witnessed or participated in atrocities. Their positive view of America stemmed partly from being treated well as prisoners, a privilege their own nation had denied to millions of victims. Their democratic conversion was pragmatic as much as principled. They'd learned that democratic capitalism created prosperity and military power that authoritarianism couldn't match. The POW experience hadn't created moral transformation so much as practical recognition. The American system worked better than alternatives. This was sufficient for rebuilding Germany, but insufficient for achieving justice or reconciliation. The men who'd enjoyed comfortable captivity while Holocaust victims died in concentration camps, who'd eaten steaks while slave laborers starved, who'd played sports while resistance fighters faced execution. These men faced no reckoning for their participation in history's greatest crime. This moral failure haunted post-war Germany and complicated the legacy of the POW program. Yes, the program had achieved its objectives, demonstrating American values, encouraging reciprocal treatment of American POWs, and preparing German prisoners for democratic reconstruction. But it had also provided comfort to enemy soldiers while victims suffered, treating perpetrators better than those they persecuted. The tension between these realities, humanitarian treatment of enemies versus justice for victims, remained unresolved. The POW program succeeded operationally and strategically. Whether it succeeded morally depends on frameworks for evaluating competing obligations in war's impossible circumstances.
The numbers tell their own story, stark and unambiguous. Between July 1943 and July 1946, the United States imprisoned 371,683 German POWs in 511 camps across 44 states. This represented approximately 6% of total German prisoners captured by Western allies during the war. The remainder were held in Britain, France, and other Allied nations, or captured by Soviet forces and sent to labor camps in Russia. American POW facilities ranged from major base camps holding thousands of prisoners to small branch camps housing fewer than 50 men. The largest, Camp Alva, Oklahoma, Camp Hearne, Texas, Camp Stark, New Hampshire, Camp Clinton, Mississippi, and Camp Ellis, Illinois, became small cities complete with internal administration, recreational facilities, educational programs, and medical services. The death rate among German POWs in American custody was approximately 0.15%, roughly 560 deaths over 3 years from disease, accidents, and natural causes. This compared to death rates of approximately 3.5% in British custody, 2.6% in French custody, and estimates ranging from 14 to 35% in Soviet custody, where exact numbers remain disputed due to incomplete records.
The low American death rate reflected Geneva Convention compliance and adequate medical care, nutrition, and housing. Prisoners received the same 4,000-calorie daily ration as American troops: meat, vegetables, bread, dairy, products, coffee, and desserts. Medical facilities at each camp provided treatment for injuries and illnesses. Housing met minimum standards with heating, sanitation, and adequate space per prisoner. The labor program employed approximately 90% of able-bodied prisoners in agriculture, forestry, light manufacturing, and food processing. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day, approximately $12 in 2025 dollars, paid in camp scrip redeemable for canteen goods or convertible to currency sent home through Red Cross channels. total wages paid to German POWs exceeded $22 million during the program, $340 million in 2025 dollars. This labor partially offset prisoner maintenance costs, but operated at net economic loss to the U.S. government. Maintaining the POW system cost approximately $250 million, $3.85 billion in 2025 dollars, over 3 years, while prisoner labor generated approximately $80 million in value, $1.23 billion in 2025 dollars. The deficit was accepted as necessary for Geneva Convention compliance and encouraging reciprocal German treatment of American POWs. The reciprocal treatment calculation succeeded imperfectly. Germany held approximately 95,000 American POWs during the war, primarily captured in Western European campaigns. Death rates among American POWs in German custody reached approximately 1.2%, significantly higher than Germans in American custody, but lower than prisoners held by Japan, approximately 27% death rate.
German treatment of American POWs varied significantly by location and timing. Prisoners captured in Western Europe generally received adequate treatment under Geneva Convention standards. Those captured in Eastern Europe or held in camps during the war's final collapse faced much worse conditions as German supply systems collapsed entirely. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944 produced thousands of American prisoners who experienced brutal conditions during transport and imprisonment in the war's final months. The American POW program's success in maintaining low death rates and Geneva Convention compliance provided moral authority for post-war trials of German and Japanese officials charged with POW mistreatment. American prosecutors could demonstrate that adequate prisoner treatment was possible even under wartime constraints, undermining defense claims that mistreatment resulted from unavoidable circumstances rather than deliberate policy. Beyond the immediate operational numbers, the strategic accounting reveals the true impact. American war production during World War II totaled
312,973 military aircraft, all types, 88,410 tanks and self-propelled guns, 257,390 artillery pieces, 2,382,311 military trucks and vehicles, 6,771 naval vessels, all types, 4,425 cargo ships, 41.4 billion rounds of ammunition, 812,000 tons of bombs.
German production during the same period totaled 119,307 military aircraft, 67,429 tanks and self-propelled guns, 159,147 artillery pieces, 345,914 military trucks and vehicles, 1,595 naval vessels.
The production ratios tell the story. German POWs witnessed firsthand. America produced 2.5 times more aircraft, 1.3 times more tanks, while also supplying thousands to Britain and Russia, 1.6 times more artillery, 6.9 times more trucks, 4.2 times more naval vessels, and 5 times more ammunition than Germany. And America achieved this while maintaining civilian prosperity that exceeded pre-war standards. The steel production comparison proved even more devastating. America produced approximately 680 million tons of steel during the war years 1941 to 1945. Germany produced approximately 145 million tons during the same period. American steel production exceeded German output by nearly 5 to 1, while supporting both military production and civilian needs. These numbers explain why German POWs experienced psychological transformation
when confronting American industrial capacity. The disparity wasn't marginal, it was categorical, rendering German victory strategically impossible regardless of tactical excellence or operational skill. The comparative tank production illustrates this clearly. Germany's Panther V Panther tank, introduced in 1943, was arguably the finest medium tank design of the war. It featured sloped armor, a high-velocity 75mm gun, excellent mobility, and sophisticated engineering. Each Panther required approximately 55,000 man-hours to produce. Germany manufactured 6,706 Panthers from January 1943 through April 1945. Americans' M4 Sherman medium tank was inferior by most technical metrics: thinner armor, less powerful gun, lower top speed. But each Sherman required approximately 10,000 man-hours to produce, and American factories manufactured 49,238 Shermans during the war.
German Panthers achieved better kill ratios in tank versus tank combat. Estimates suggest individual Panthers destroyed 3 to 5 Shermans before being knocked out. But America produced 7.3 Shermans for every Panther Germany built. The mathematics guaranteed American victory through overwhelming numerical superiority that rendered German technological advantages irrelevant.
This calculation applied across every weapon system and resource category. German submarines achieved better kill ratios than Allied destroyers and aircraft. But Allied shipyards produced cargo vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. German fighter aces achieved better individual scores than Allied pilots, but American training programs produced 5 pilots for every German ace. German artillery was more accurate and sophisticated than Allied equivalents, but American industry produced shells in quantities that made precision less important than volume. The POW experience exposed these realities to men who'd believed Nazi propaganda about Aryan superiority and enemy weakness. The revelation destroyed not just faith in German victory, but confidence in the entire ideological framework that had justified the war. Post-war memoirs from German POWs consistently emphasized this theme. They'd fought courageously, believed in their cause, and trusted their leadership, only to discover they'd been committed to an impossible war by leaders who'd either not understood or not cared about industrial realities that made victory unattainable. Reinhold Paubel, the POW who escaped and lived in Chicago as Philip Brick, later wrote, "We fought with honor for a dishonorable cause. Led by men who sent us to die in a war they should have known we could never win. The American experience taught me that patriotism means questioning your government, not obeying blindly. I became more German by becoming American, learning to think critically, demand accountability, and recognize that nationalism without morality is barbarism." Paubel's observation captured the POW program's unintended achievement. It demonstrated that American democracy and industrial capitalism produced not just military power, but human dignity, individual freedom, and social prosperity that authoritarian systems couldn't match. The lesson spread through 371,683 prisoners who returned home, carrying knowledge that shaped Germany's post-war reconstruction.
August 23, 1943. Fort Meade, Maryland. Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Luth stood at the camp fence, watching Sherman tanks roll past on their way to war. September 15, 1946. Bremerhaven, Germany. Luth, no longer Kapitänleutnant, no longer anything but a repatriated prisoner, stepped off the transport ship onto rubble-strewn docks. The port facilities lay in ruins, destroyed by the same strategic bombing campaign he'd once believed was failing. He carried two possessions: a duffel bag containing worn clothing and a few personal items, and knowledge that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The journey from Fort Meade to Bremerhaven had spanned 3 years and destroyed certainties he'd built a lifetime believing. He'd survived U-boat warfare, North African imprisonment, Atlantic transport, American captivity, and repatriation, but he hadn't survived psychologically intact. The man who'd received the Knight's Cross from Hitler was gone, replaced by someone who understood that courage, honor, and skill meant nothing when committed to an impossible cause.
Luth walked through Bremerhaven's ruins, searching for transport to his family in Bavaria. American occupation troops directed traffic, distributed food rations, and maintained order with casual efficiency. German civilians queued for bread using Allied military marks, the occupation currency that had replaced worthless Reichsmarks. Children begged American soldiers for chocolate and cigarettes. Old women sorted through rubble, salvaging bricks for reconstruction. This was the Germany that had challenged American industrial might. This was the nation whose leaders had believed they could match American production, outlast American resolve, and achieve victory through superior will and tactical excellence. This was the homeland that had sent millions to die in a war its leadership should have recognized as unwinnable before it began. The irony struck Luth with physical force. He'd eaten better in American captivity than German civilians had eaten during the entire war. He'd worked for wages while German workers had labored without adequate compensation. He'd lived in comfortable barracks while German cities burned. He'd witnessed American abundance while his nation descended into starvation and ruin. And the most bitter realization, American treatment of German POWs, the Geneva Convention compliance, the adequate food and housing, the respect for human dignity, represented everything Nazi ideology had claimed democratic societies couldn't provide. The decadent, weak, plutocratic democracy had defeated German militarism not through matching German brutality, but through demonstrating that humane treatment and industrial efficiency could coexist. Luth eventually reached his family in Bavaria, finding them alive but traumatized by years of bombing, food shortages, and fear. He told them about America, the factories, the abundance, the treatment he'd received. They listened with expressions mixing disbelief and recognition. Of course America had won. How could it have been otherwise? But knowing the outcome doesn't ease the suffering or restore what was lost. Luth's family had survived, but millions hadn't. The Germany that had existed before the war was gone forever, replaced by occupied zones governed by former enemies, divided between competing systems, reduced from European power to object of international pity and disgust. The POW experience had taught Luth that wars are won in factories before they're fought on battlefields, that industrial capacity determines strategic outcomes more decisively than tactical skill, and that leaders who commit nations to wars without understanding economic fundamentals condemn their people to inevitable defeat regardless of battlefield courage.
These lessons shaped post-war Germany. The Federal Republic, established in West Germany in 1949, embraced democratic governance and market capitalism not from ideological conversion, but from practical recognition. The American system produced better results. The economic miracle of the 1950s succeeded because Germans like Luth understood that prosperity came from the same sources that had generated American wartime production: free markets, individual initiative, and democratic accountability. The prisoners who'd witnessed American industrial might became advocates for the very systems Nazi ideology had condemned. They'd seen democracy work efficiently. They'd experienced capitalism creating abundance. They'd observed that treating workers well produced better results than coercion.
These observations, multiplied across 371,683 returnees and shared with millions of family members and friends, created grassroots support for Western-oriented reconstruction. The Soviet alternative, imposed on East Germany, offered comparison. Both Germanys began from identical conditions in 1945: complete defeat, total destruction, and zero industrial capacity. By 1960, West Germany had rebuilt into Europe's strongest economy, while East Germany remained impoverished and repressive. The difference wasn't German work ethic or cultural factors. Both populations shared these. The difference was systems: democratic capitalism versus communist authoritarianism. Germans who'd experienced American POW camps understood this intuitively. They'd witnessed the connection between individual freedom and collective prosperity, between democratic governance and efficient administration, between treating people humanely and achieving superior results. These lessons couldn't be erased by propaganda or coercion.
The ultimate irony of the German POW program was this: America's commitment to Geneva Convention compliance and humane treatment, undertaken primarily to protect American POWs held by Germany, accidentally created the most effective denazification program imaginable. No re-education curriculum, no war crimes trial, no occupation policy could match the psychological impact of spending years witnessing American abundance while Nazi propaganda claimed American weakness. The prisoners learned through direct experience that they'd been lied to, that German ideology was false, and that the war had been unwinnable from the start. These realizations spread through German society via returning POWs, helping create psychological readiness for democratic transformation that occupation authorities couldn't have imposed through force alone. Wolfgang Luth died in 1956 in Bavaria, having lived 11 years in the Federal Republic he'd helped build through his advocacy for democratic reforms and market economics. He'd never forgotten the Sherman tanks at Fort Meade, the moment his certainties had begun crumbling. He'd told the story hundreds of times to family, friends, and political colleagues. Each telling reinforced the lesson: industrial capacity determines modern warfare outcomes, and systems that create prosperity in peace create power in war.
That lesson remains relevant today. Military doctrine still emphasizes logistics, production capacity, and economic mobilization as foundations of strategic power. Nations still invest in industrial base preservation, recognizing that factories matter more than fortresses. The principle that guided American victory in 1945 still shapes defense planning in 2025. Sustainable military power emerges from economic vitality, democratic governance, and systems that treat human dignity as strategic asset rather than tactical inconvenience. The German POWs who witnessed American industrial might learned this lesson at personal cost: the destruction of beliefs they'd held dear, the recognition that their sacrifices had served an evil cause, the knowledge that leaders they'd trusted had committed them to an impossible war. But their learning created possibility for future generations, Germans born after 1945 who would never know authoritarianism, never experience the poverty of command economies, never fight wars of conquest. In that sense, the POW program succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. It didn't just maintain prisoners humanely or comply with international law. It transformed enemies into advocates,
changed minds through material demonstration rather than ideological argument, and helped ensure that the generation who'd fought for Hitler would raise children committed to democracy.
The Sherman tanks that Wolfgang Luth watched rolling past Fort Meade in August 1943 weren't just weapons. They were arguments. Steel proof of propositions about which systems work and which systems fail. Those arguments proved more convincing than any propaganda campaign, more transformative than any re-education program, more lasting than any military victory. 79 years after Luth stepped off the ship at Bremerhaven, Germany remains democratic, prosperous, and peaceful. A transformation owing something to 371,683 prisoners who learned, against their will and contrary to everything they'd believed, that the nation they'd fought was stronger, richer, and more humane than the nation they'd served. That remains the final accounting of the German POW experience in America. Not prisoners held, but minds changed. Not enemies defeated, but future citizens prepared. Not a program of captivity, but accidentally, improbably, a program of liberation.